Well, we're into a new series, and you might think, good, we're done with prayer. Not really. As you'll see as we go through, the book of Jonah is filled with prayer. In fact, next week, all of chapter 2 is a prayer. So, we're not done with prayer, but we're going to take a different look at prayer in the context of everyday life. Now, the story of Jonah is probably very familiar to you, but there are people who debate whether or not Jonah was a real story and really happened. And to that end, my answer to the question is, what did Jesus believe about Jonah? So I've got a couple of verses I want to show you to begin with that Jesus spoke about Jonah. So the first one is Matthew 12. So this is the middle of the conversation, the middle of things happening. We're just jumping in to listen to what Jesus says about Jonah. He answered, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah." A little bit further in the book, in Matthew 16, so another occurrence. It says, "A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except for the sign of Jonah." And if we flip over to Luke, another occurrence, as the crowds increase, Jesus said, "This is a wicked generation. It asks for a sign, but none will be given except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was a sign to the Ninevites, so also the Son of Man, so also will the Son of Man be to this generation." So Jesus is making reference to Jonah as a real person and a real event. Not just a good story that we tell children, but a real event that happened in the life of one of God's prophets and in the life of the people of Nineveh. So from that standpoint, I say it must be real. Not just some big fish story, as fishermen like to tell. You know, it was really this big, but of course, when I didn't catch it, it was this big. So as we look at this story, things are topsy-turvy in this story. They are upside down from the way they should be. And we should notice that as we go through this story. When Jonah is a prophet, what should our minds think when it says Jonah was a prophet? He's called by God, he's set aside, he's designated for a specific event and task, and he is going to go and fulfill what God's called him to do. Now, we know some prophets argue with God at times and say, "I'm not worthy, and I shouldn't be called on to do this." That's not Jonah's problem. Jonah knows he's going to be effective. He doesn't want to be. The other thing is, Jonah should be the one pointing us to God and directing the people towards God, but instead, Jonah's trying not to do that, but everyone around him, even though Jonah just says the bare minimum that he needs to say, we'll see that everyone sees clearly who God is. Even when Jonah is not acting righteously, but acting wickedly, and even though the wicked, evil people, instead of acting wickedly, act righteously. In this story, notice how everything is turned upside down from the way it should be. With that in mind, as we're thinking about and going to look at the story of Jonah, we all know Jonah runs away. He wants to get out of doing what he's been told to do. And we've got to leave the answer for why to chapter 4. Don't want to run ahead of ourselves. We just know at this point he's running away and he doesn't want to do what God's told him to do. Now, I don't want anyone to raise their hands, but I was thinking this week about, have you ever tried to get out of doing something that you don't like doing, and either your mom or your spouse asked you to do something? And I got to thinking, what are some ways in which we try try to get out of doing what we've been asked to do. And one of the first things that I thought was, well, we kind of disappear. Right? My spouse wants me to take out the garbage or do the dishes or do something else, and I can find something outside in the yard to do. Right? I can find something to go through. Oh, I need to run to the store, whatever. I can find a place to go and hide and not be seen so that I don't have to get asked to do it or reminded to do it. And I was thinking, as a kid, one of the things that I would do at times is if my mom was looking for me and then I'd hear her coming, you could hear she's coming close, she's almost to where you are, and even if I was watching TV, all of a sudden it's like, and to make sure she knew you were really sleeping, you'd throw in a couple of snores, right? And hopefully she wouldn't wake me and she'd just get tired of waiting for it to get done and she'd go do it herself. And there's other ways in which we do that too. We hide, we pretend to be asleep, we do all kinds of things at times to avoid doing what we've been asked to do. In fact, I think I recall a couple of times trying really hard to get out of something so much that I tried to get myself grounded to get out of doing the dishes, because if I got sent to my room, I obviously couldn't do the dishes if I was in my room. That's how bad I hate doing the dishes. My second job was a dishwasher, by the way. But I'm setting that up because it's real easy at times to look at Scripture and either point the finger at the person in the story for doing things that probably we at times have done ourselves. Or it's easy to say, I'd never be like that person. And with Jonah, we don't want to be like Jonah. Jonah is the anti-example of what we should do in serving God. But we need to see how everyone reacts to Jonah. And how everyone, even though Jonah is unfaithful to what he is called to do, everyone around him sees the hand of God upon him and cannot deny the power of God. So let's turn to the book of Jonah. We're going to read all of chapter 1 today. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed to Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed to Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. They threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? From what are your people?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that this is my fault, that the great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. And they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." And they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, just to help us get an idea to begin with, I've got a map. And if you can see where Nineveh is, it's where the red arrow is pointing. And where he got on the boat is at the bottom of the red arrow, which is Joppa. And where he was trying to go to is all the way over to Spain. I mean, he's trying to get as far away as possible. Now, I think when I was a kid, or early on, I got Tarsus, where Paul was from, mixed up with Tarshish. And I thought, well, he could have went by land. Now, imagine if he went by land all the way over to Tarshish. That would have taken a long time and would have been a huge cost and expense. He could just pay the fare, get on a boat, get out of there. No doubt some of us have felt like that in our lives. We have something that we need to do, and we're overwhelmed by the circumstance, and we'd love to just get on a boat and go the other direction. You know, if God came and said, well, you need to go work at Inner City Grand Rapids Ferry Church, and we said, great, we won't go down to Muskegon, we get on a boat so that we can go to Canada. It doesn't make sense, right? The people of God should be obedient to God. Like I said, I don't want to give away, but in chapter 4, we finally find out. Why does he run away? What is it that he's running away from? It's not fear of speaking to people. It's not that he doesn't feel qualified. In fact, Jonah has a very high view of himself. Jonah runs from God. And when Jonah is running from God, he causes problems for people around him. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time out on Lake Michigan unless it was when I was a kid and my grandma drove her boat. But I imagine if you're out there like a sailor, that Lake Michigan would probably be in some way similar to the Mediterranean Sea. And storms, when they come up, you get swells that are going on. And if you're a seasoned sailor, you'd understand how risky a certain storm would be as it arises. And if you were going to plan a course to go to Milwaukee, you would plan a route according to knowing what time of year it was, what the weather was, and what the forecast was, and take what you needed for the trip. So sometimes you may go straight across, other times you hug the shoreline just in case you get in trouble so that you would have a port to go into. These are seasoned sailors. I mean, if they're going all the way from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, this isn't their first voyage. But the storm arises, and they are frightened. If you've ever been with an expert in a situation, and the expert suddenly looks worried, you ever had that situation? The expert who knows what's going on suddenly gets a worried look on their face. These sailors are in full panic mode. They're in full panic mode, and notice what they do. They pray to their gods, and they make sure everyone else is praying to their God. So much so that the captain personally goes to Jonah. The captain is so afraid. He's probably the most experienced man on the ship. He's so afraid of the storm. And notice what it said in the text. Find my page here. Okay? All the sailors were afraid, and they cried out to their own God. They knew that the storm was not a natural storm. It was beyond what they has seen. They're crying out to their God because that's the only one they know. Hey, maybe it's not my God that's angry. Maybe it's your God that's angry. Let's go get your God prayed for. Maybe it's not your God. Maybe it's another person's God. Let's get them prayed for. This wasn't a time for saying my God is the right God. This was a time for saying whose God did it. Because it didn't matter whose God did it. If it's the right God, we get them praying, and their God answers the prayer. That's all we care about, saving our lives. They get Jonah. He's asleep. I love the caption. How can you sleep? I mean, if you've ever been on a lake when there's 3 to 5 foot swells, I don't know how you can sleep. I imagine this storm is probably even greater than that, maybe 7 to 8 foot swells in a wooden boat. And Jonah's sleeping. Captain wakes him up. And Jonah really, look at how he responds. He's just only answering questions. He's not really freely giving him any information. They had battered him with questions. Look how I rattled through them. You get somebody cornered and they're just rattling off the questions. Who is it responsible for making the trouble? What kind of work do you do? Where did you come from? What's your country? Who are your people? They're battering him with everything they can think of to try to solve the problem. And then somewhere along the way he says, I serve the God who made heaven and earth, the God of heaven. He made the sea and the dry land. I'm running from him. You're running from the God who made the sea on the sea? Hello? Hello? You're running from the God who made the sea on the sea. If you're running on land, maybe earthquakes would have followed you. Get away from us, guy. And they are in awe of the power of God that they saw on the sea. And they beg that Jonah pray to his God. And then, do we see Jonah respond by praying to God? No. No, we don't. He just admits what's going on. He says, yeah, I know it's my fault. It's my fault you're in this situation. It's my fault the storm came. But he's not praying to God, asking the storm to calm down. And they got to come up with a solution. And since Jonah has admitted he's a prophet of God, they ask, what should we do? He says, throw me into the sea. Now, before we think that through, that Jonah was actually saying what God wanted to have happen, because we know the rest of the story, Jonah really, this is probably the most selfish thing he does in the whole story. He still doesn't want to go to Nineveh. Throw me overboard. He doesn't care if the sea actually probably calms down. He doesn't care about these sailors on the boat. He's like, God found me. It's all over. Just throw me overboard. At least I'll die and I won't have to go to Nineveh. This is not a heroic act that he's doing and saying, well, sacrifice me. God will spare your lives. No, it's throw me over. I still don't want to go to Nineveh. And notice how they respond. No, we're not doing that. You told us you're a prophet of God. The God who's just made this storm, we're going to throw you overboard and kill you. And he's going to go, hey, nice job, guys. No, their boat's going over with you. So here are these sailors in the middle of a storm with a prophet of God who doesn't want to do what God's told him to do. What do? They pray to a God they've never known. They see the power of God. They cry out to God for mercy. And they're very specific in what they pray for. God, your prophet told us to do this. We don't think that that's necessarily right. We please, don't kill us. Don't smite us for doing what he told us. We're going to throw him overboard. We see him as innocent because he's your prophet. We're going to throw him overboard, but please. That's it. Don't come back on us. He's innocent. Don't count the blood on us. He told us to do it. Then they throw him overboard. You know what? Calm. If they weren't scared now, imagine that you're in the middle of a storm, all of a sudden the God who you just prayed to made everything calm. Whew. I bet the hair on the back of their neck was standing up straight. And they were terrified. And look at their response. This one puzzled me for a while when I first read it, because you just kind of glance over it, because it's just a short little thing. It says, then they greatly feared the Lord. They offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. They threw all their cargo overboard. What are they sacrificing? Whatever they had kept, because it was too valuable to throw overboard. They're now making a sacrifice to God with their very own personal valuables. Now, I don't know if it's a burnt offering that they're making a sacrifice to God, but they make a sacrifice to God and vows to God, a God that they only met moments before. And this is the power of God. And he shows up in the midst of the storm. And the storm itself was enough to point people to the power of God. Because these sailors knew it was from God himself. Now, I wish there was a follow-up story here that told us what the sailors did afterwards and where they went and everything else, but we leave the sailors and we have Jonah. And what a contrast it is. A man who's willing to die not to do what God's called him to do, and a bunch of sailors who were afraid to do what the prophet of God told them to do because they fear God that much. And at times I wonder where we are. Are we more like Jonah, who when we're asked or given an opportunity or called specifically, and we know we're called to do something, we say, God, I don't want to. I really don't want to. Find somebody else. We try to find a way to hide from him. Or are there times where we're more like the sailors? When everything around us feels like the world is caving in, but all we can see is the hand of God in the midst of it. We know that there is a real God. And we know that if we are obedient to him, he has the power to calm the storm and to still our lives. And I hope we see the sailors who didn't know God, but are drawn to him, and we want to be like them. Let's pray. God, you are awesome and powerful. We've had rain off and on all week, and we know you're in control. We know there's a hurricane going through the Gulf right now, and you are in control. God, take control of our lives. Help us not to run. Help us not to hide in the bottom of the boat, so to speak. And help us not to just fall asleep so we don't have to do what we've been called to do. Help us to be salt and light in the world, wherever we go. Help us to be a light shining on a hill, shining in the darkness, to bring light to the world. And we pray this all in Jesus' mighty name. Amen. Amen.